Hi everyone, it's Karen back again to take you through Module 4. Today we're going to be talking about identifying meaningful insights from primary and secondary research. So in terms of our agenda, I'll minimize this so you can see the slide. We'll do a quick recap from last week's session. We'll touch upon the goals of what we're hoping to accomplish this week. We'll then dive into kind of the definition and the role of primary versus secondary research and really how to choose the right method based on whatever business problem you have at hand. And then like last week, I'll switch off and then you can find a secondary video within this module where Andy will review the actual research plan for the Nature Zone case study that you are studying throughout this course. So last week, remember, was all about customer journey maps. So we talked about the business rationale for why we create them. We talked about how we use them to generate insights, and of course, how those insights can be leveraged to drive impactful communications and advertising. This week, we're really going to talk a little bit more about techniques. So specifically, we'll look at primary versus secondary research, within that qualitative versus quantitative, a couple of different techniques that kind of blend both with social listening, semiotics, and biometrics. And then we'll really focus on how to design a research plan that gets you those high potency insights you need to solve business problems. So diving right into kind of a little bit of a refresher on primary versus secondary research. So the big difference here is really whether or not the information you need to answer your business question already exists. So if there's information that already exists to help you with your challenge, then you're doing secondary research over here on the left side of this slide, commonly called desk research. And it involves kind of compiling different data sources through all internal and external resources. So on the next slide, we'll look at what those could be. If the research you need to make your business decision does not exist, then you are off to do primary research. So that is research that you or someone you hire collects for you. And as you probably know, there's two main parts of primary research that can be either quantitative or qualitative. And while we have this kind of neatly siloed on the left and right hand of this slide, most of the time research projects require a mix of both. And in practice, usually we see secondary research before a primary research project or coming in after a primary research project to layer on context based on whatever findings you have. So in practice, often we're blending both of these techniques. To touch a little on why you might do secondary research, it's really two reasons. It's faster and cheaper. In terms of what the secondary sources could be, these really run the gamut. We see government sources like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, of course, the census, academic journals, media institutes, organizations just like the ARF constantly are doing their own research, posting their own studies, and then more kind of longitudinal syndicated data sources like a Nielsen or a Pew or a Gallup that collect lots of data, and then they sell it to multiple different partners or agencies that can all leverage that data together. And then not to discredit any internal data sources that you might have at hand. Website data, customer satisfaction data, any kind of previous research campaign results, for example, all of that can be, leveraged again in an effort to do any type of secondary research that might come across your desk. Again, we talked about this on the last slide, but we think of secondary research often as an adjunctive method in combination with primary research, either before or after, because secondary research almost never fits the problem exactly. It can be helped to use to aid or us in a decision, but oftentimes it doesn't actually fully answer the question, which tends to require much more customized solutions. And those customized solutions tend to come in primary research. And primary research largely falls into two traditional buckets. You have your quantitative on the left and your qualitative on the right. So we can think about quantitative research being much more about exactitude. So you would use quantitative research to measure something, to quantify how many, to establish a fact or establish kind of known entities. and to confirm. So we have hypotheses and we want to actually measure whether those are true or not. On the flip side, qual is much more about exploring. It's much more about going deep and understanding and providing a lot of context. And it tends to be, more flexible in that way. So to build on that, quantitative can be about testing theories, testing hypotheses, really testing anything. In terms of A versus B, lends itself more to kind of a quantitative approach versus something that's much more open-ended, where you're exploring ideas or trying to formulate a hypothesis that then might go into quantitative research. That is more suited for qual. Big difference is the sample size. So quantitative, you tend to have large sample sizes. Qualitative, you have much smaller sample sizes. And as a result, what you are achieving through quant tends to be statistically reliable. And if something is statistically reliable, we can project that out to total populations because those results are much more stable. Versus the smaller sample sizes in qualitative research are not projectable and tend to be more impressionistic, just given the amount of noise that can occur in those small data sets. So we really tend to use the insights that we gather from qual more directional. Quantitative, just given that it is more about establishing, measuring, quantifying, it tends to be much more structured and less flexible versus qual. Once you're in process, you do have more opportunity to test, learn, and iterate, and there tends to be more flexibility in that type of method. The way that we express the results of these different types of research tend to be a little bit different. So quantitative tends to be expressed in numbers, graphs, dashboards, all types of data visualization versus qual that tends to be expressed more often in words. And then in terms of the actual methods within these types of research for quant, you have traditional surveys, experiments, and any type of numeric observation versus qual, where we are looking more at focus groups, in-depth interviews, ethnos, online communities, bulletin boards, and so on. We talked a little bit about social listening last week in terms of how it can help us populate a customer journey map. And I like to think of this as a bit of an adjunctive technique because it's not traditional quant and it's not traditional qual, but it is quantitative in the sense that the amount of data available to us is very large in sample size, but the way that it tends to be analyzed tends to be more qualitative in that we're reading through, or we're culling through all of that data, creating thematics, and while we can size it, oftentimes it's not presented that way. So it is a little bit of a mix of quant and qual when we're using those types of data. Semiotics is really the study of symbols, linguistic signs, what is being communicated by the actual imagery in our language or in our written language, I should say, and how different consumers are receiving that. So there's some interesting studies that can be done via that method. And then, of course, we also have biometrics, which is really adept at getting at the subconscious through different methods like eye tracking or facial coding or EEG, ECG, which are tracking, even your sweat response to understand your emotion, your attention, your cognitive processing, all of those, again, subconscious factors that can help unlock true consumer motivations or consumer response. Next, we wanted to touch a little bit on how you would go about defining or designing a research plan. We assume that many of you are enrolled but are not actually doing the research. You're oftentimes going to hire a company to do the research for you. But no matter where you sit or in what type of role you're in, it's very helpful to understand, well, how would I even put together an RFP? What are the things I need to think about when I'm evaluating a research plan? What are the different benchmarks that we should be looking at as we go through this process? So in general, thinking about how we would create a research plan, most importantly is to define the business problem, to really crystallize, well, what is it that we are trying to solve for? And then translating that into a research objective. How can my research solve that business problem? And that can be tricky. And sometimes it's not that clear, and not having a clear sense of your objectives and translating them to a research objective can lead to kind of going astray as we move further down our plan. So super, super important to be really crystal clear at the beginning of this process in terms of what we are trying to solve. Of course, you'll evaluate providers if you're hiring externally, you'll decide on the research method, execute that method. So if you're doing quantitative, you might field some surveys. If you're doing qual, you might hold some focus groups. You'll process the data, whether that's actually crunching data in SPSS or creating if you have larger data and you're running that through Tableau, or if it's even just coding open-end responses to really find thematics within that data. Once that data is tabulated and in a coded form that's easy to digest, you'll really look through that data and look for insights. You'll think about what you're seeing in your data. You'll triangulate that against what you know about your brand and what you know about what's happening in culture, and what you know about just human behavior. And together with all of those data points, we will help extract insights. And then, of course, we'll just need to visualize that in a meaningful way for our stakeholders. Okay. So in terms of how we think about choosing the right method, here we're looking at kind of a continuum of where we think different types of research can fall. As we move left to right, we think largely from new products and services, moving more towards mature products and services on the right-hand side of the slide. So in general, you have, for new products and services, things around category understanding. So attitude and usage. How do people, if say we're talking about a toothpaste brand, well, what are the attitudes about oral care? What are the actual behaviors? How often are they replenishing their toothpaste? What are the other types of products that are in their toothpaste, I should say oral care routine? How does mouthwash fit in? All of those different types of attitudes, all of those different types of behaviors that are useful for you as you start to understand your category could be considered a part of an attitude and usage study. You then have market structure, segmentation research, of course. So we want to understand the different types of users within our category. Sometimes segmentation can come really at the beginning. It can also come at the end if you're trying to just create segments for a communication strategy. Segmentation is really useful throughout the product funnel. Next, we have brand elasticity, line extension. What types of offerings should I go based on my kind of central product? How can that be extended? Social listening, that's again one of the different types of research that can really fall all throughout this product life cycle. And then customer journeys, which we talked about in depth last week. Next, moving into product creation. Here we're thinking about, your traditional concept creation, co-creation groups are really popular now in terms of getting consumers together to actually create ideas in tandem with brands. Concept screens, concept tests, where we float a couple of different ideas to consumers, and then we're able to provide some advanced statistical rigor to actually model out how we think that this product might do. Conjoint or choice tests, where we're really trying to understand the best kind of suite of offerings within a product or the different aspects of a product per se as you build towards a go-to-market strategy. Variety lineup research, what are the different SKUs maybe perhaps that you would offer as you launch a product, and name testing. In terms of 4Ps, we can do traditional pricing research, package research. What is this package telling a consumer? How can we optimize it? Product testing, where we actually are sending our products to consumers and having them spend some time with them and give us feedback. Sales volume forecasting, and channel research to understand where we should be thinking about messaging, which leads us into comm strategy. This is probably where I have done the bulk of my career, really spending time in communication strategy research, but anything from positioning research, where is the white space for my brand, claims research, what should I say about my brand that will make it unique versus competitors, message testing. I have A, B, and C that I can say. One might be more rational, one might be more emotional, which is going to be most resonant. ad testing, and this comes in all forms. Really, we can test ad concepts, or we can test animatics, we can test storyboards, we can test full up ads, really, whatever ad-like object you have created, you could find a vendor to test that for you. There are plenty of companies that do just that in terms of ad testing. And then brand tracking in terms of how how your communication strategy is potentially resonating, and is it, resonating in terms of overall brand performance. Lastly, we're looking here at performance management. So how am I doing in market? So marketing mix modeling. How are the different channels that I have activated working? Which is most successful? What is the overall mix of all of those things? Web analytics, of course, what's happening on our sites, on our apps. Ad tracking, brand tracking, what's happening in market with my advertising. Is it driving higher recall? Again, we see some social sentiment tracking here. And then, of course, you have your customer sentiment tracking here as well. Okay, so next we're going to do just a couple of quick examples of how these different methods can be used across these different parts of the spectrum. So thinking first about category understanding, I once worked on the launch of a brand new, really transformative prescription medication to treat treatment-resistant depression. And as we worked with this company to understand their go-to-market strategy, they really needed to get deep, deep category understanding. So there was a whole bunch of different things that went into this research project, and it lasted a really long time. But one of the things we did was just social listening to understand what was the seasonality of which people were talking about depression. And, not surprisingly, perhaps we saw that a little bit higher towards those winter months. And where was the conversation happening so that we could understand how people talked about their treatment resistant depression as we really started to understand some of the emotions that went into their relationship with their prescription medications. We also did in-depth interviews. Of course, with something so sensitive as something like depression, you would never want to do something like a focus group. You really want to have a one-on-one with a highly skilled moderator or host, if you will, to have those very, very sensitive, nuanced conversations. So here you're looking at just one example of for one of the segments that we were able to create as part of this research, how their journey looked dealing with their depression. And one of the ways that we were able to kind of extract some of our insights was through metaphor elicitation. So we had tons and tons of different imagery all throughout the walls of the in-person interview. This was pre-COVID, and people were able to take pictures and tell us, this really helps visualize when I was first diagnosed with my depression versus this helps me. This is a really good visualization that helps describe how I felt when I was at my best moment and conversely at my worst moment. And we know that giving them those imagery can help really kind of get at the subconscious and help articulate things that are actually really hard to explain. So we know that these types of exercises can work really well, especially in category conversations as sensitive and as nuanced and as personal as something like depression. Totally switching gears. An example of a product ideation study was something I had worked on for a marathon brand. So I should say a brand that hosted marathons. And their question for us was, they were really trying to figure out how important the different parts of the race were in terms of if they were to get rid of something, and then all of these were then kind of correlated against how much they cost to put on as a part of putting on the race. But how important were the different parts of the race? And within each of those components, how impactful were the different options? So this is telling us that kind of price to enter the marathon was by far and away the most significant component in terms of a runner's decision to enter a marathon. But then music, distance, and the genre of music that was played were the next kind of most important versus the t-shirt and what that t-shirt said was significantly less important. And the beauty of this, which is what you're looking at, is called a conjoint exercise, which again is really looking at the importance of different components of a product. All of these on the left add to 100. So you can really quickly see at scale how the different components of your product drive to overall value. And then even within those components, so taking, music, for example, we're able to break them down even further to understand what genre of music was going to be most impactful in driving runners to decide to participate in the marathon. And here we're seeing obviously something like today's hits and classic rock were much more impactful, whereas among this sample, something like country or oldies were actually detracting from the value of that race. So this is just one example of how a conjoint test can be used to help put together the pieces, if you will, of a product. Next, moving into thinking about kind of product ideation, and that's those 4 Ps that we talked about in a couple slides ago. What we're looking at here was a concept test that I had worked on for a niche subscription video service. So an SVOD service akin to a much smaller Netflix, if you will. And the company was really trying to understand, they had a whole massive library of content, and they were trying to understand what their best play would be to build a niche subscription service in terms of the genre that would have the highest appeal. So they had enough library content to create a conspiracy slash alien slash paranormal type subscription video on demand service. They had enough to create a crime SVOD service, and they had enough to create a documentary SVOD service. And we did this research to really understand what had the highest potential to break through. So we had really just white card concept. So white card concept is just a written explanation of what the product could be. It's called white card because it really doesn't have many bells and whistles. And then, it is exposed to the consumers, and they give us our feedback on the concept. So here we saw across the different questions and metrics that we measured that the conspiracy slash alien slash paranormal product was a little bit more appealing than the other 2 that we tested, and that we were able to, via the metrics that we got through this project, really understand what the overall kind of market size could be in kind of year 1 for this type of offering, all through that concept test. Next, moving into examples of communication strategies. So worked on, this was actually for a pitch, but trying to understand what the communication strategy could be for a luxury airline brand. So one of the areas that we really wanted to unpack were more of the rational or the functional benefits. So on the horizontal, you're looking at how kind of important these attributes are. On the vertical, they're how unique these attributes are to this brand. So then in the top right, we're seeing the functional benefits that were kind of ownable territory for this luxury airline brand. And we saw one kind of stand above the rest, and that was that their planes were designed to provide maximum room across all classes and superior comfort. So really that functional benefit was something that this research was telling us we should be very forward facing with in our communication strategy. But of course, we know that the best communications kind of do touch on rational benefits, but then also are able to kind of drum up some emotion. So as we decided, we were trying to understand, well, what was the emotional white space for this brand? We did a perceptual exercise versus the other brands in the category to understand what this brand's personality was. And we plotted these on this map to understand relative to, the other, I don't know, maybe there's 8 or 9 brands on the slide. What was the unique white space for us to talk about in terms of the way that we were positioning our brand to help us stand out from the competition. And then finally, we did some ad testing. So the ad, what looks like kind of a print ad on the left, was actually just a concept. It was kind of a gussied up white card concept made to look like an ad, because we know the more that we can make the stimuli we're testing look like ads, the easier it is for consumers to ultimately react to that and provide feedback. But this was really just a concept that we had created based on all of the positioning research we had done. And then, we put it in front of consumers to understand, well, how appealing was it? How did they understand it? Did they, oh, I should block that out. Did it make them more likely to book with that airline, and so on and so forth. Brand trackers, as we think about performance management, the one you're looking at here is for kind of a larger entertainment brand. And, for a brand tracker, you look at metrics that kind of cascade down the funnel, if you will. So, thinking about familiarity, how much do I know this brand? How much affinity do I have for this brand? Do I love it? Is it one of my favorites? Moving more towards the middle of that funnel, is it a brand for someone like me? What's the relevance of this brand? And then one of the metrics that was very important for this entertainment brand was heat score. And that's kind of a measure of how much momentum the brand has. More of a behavioral KPI here in terms of intent to view. And then all the way at the bottom of that funnel, you have kind of your loyalty and advocacy measure with Net Promoter, which is really the amount of people that would advocate for your brand minus the people who would not. And then the stronger that score is, the closer to 100, the higher your Net Promoter. So this is just kind of an example of a scorecard, if you will, for something you might see in a brand tracker. And that is it for me. I know we just kind of threw a lot at you. Looking forward to discussing any of these cases with you when we meet live next week. And I will sign off, and then you will find the secondary link for Andy to overview the Nature's Own bread research plan in Brightspace. Thanks, guys.